Hello, after a brief hiatus, welcome back to the Audiobooks subproject. Today we are reading Eclipse and Re-emergence of the Communist Movement by Gilles Dauvé. I do not know how to pronounce that, it's French. I think it's more like Dauvé. Again, if this is the first time you're hearing me, my main channel is Unijoy, it's linked on this channel. I make video essays and stuff, this is just a side project I do. Also shout out to the Real Movement and the other splinter servers that have happened, because apparently communists can't get along. What a surprise. This will be covering the prefaces and maybe the first chapter if I can be fucked. I'm reading this on libcom.org, there'll be a link in the description. It was first published in 1974 and beginning of the audiobook. Preface to the Japanese edition of number 1 and number 2 of Le Mouvement Communiste. The first two essays in this book were translated and published in Japan in the 1970s. Here is the 1973 preface, modified and abridged with new notes added. In France, as everywhere else, what is usually known as Marxism has nothing to do with revolution. In this topsy-turvy world, wage laborers are exploited in socialist countries, whilst communist parties support capitalism in more ways than one. Communism has become a synonym for working hard and obeying one's socialist boss. Most parties called communist have been and are nationalist, colonialist, and imperialist. As Paul Matic wrote at the close of the Second World War, "Today, every program and designation has lost its meaning. Socialists speak in capitalistic terms, capitalists in socialistic terms, and everybody believes anything and nothing." This situation is merely the climax of a long development, which has been initiated by the labour movement itself. Only by standing outside the labour movement has it been possible to work towards decisive social changes. The first condition for a minimum revolutionary action is indeed to stand outside and break with all forms of Marxism, whether they come from CPs or left-wing intellectuals. Marxism is part of capitalist society in its theory as well as in its practice. Nowadays, when the long counter-revolution which followed the post-1917 revolutionary movement is finally coming to a close, a new movement is rising. At the same time, capital is trying to defang it, and is preparing to destroy it violently if it cannot be deflected. The re-emergence of revolution is accompanied by many forms of superficial criticism which do not go to the heart of the matter, and help capital adapt itself. Obviously, radicalization results from diverse experiences, but pseudo-revolutionary groups deliberately gather people on partial demands in order to prevent them to go any further. They claim to go back to revolutionary principles, but are ignorant of them. At best, their view of communism mixes partial social reshuffling with democratic worker control or management plus automation. In other words, no more than what capital itself talks about. They critically support the official CPs, socialist parties, the USSR, China, Cuba, etc. These groups are counter-revolutionary. The argument that they organize workers is irrelevant. CPs do the same, which does not prevent them from repressing workers when they think it necessary. Trotskyism, Maoism, even anarchism in some bureaucratic and degenerated forms are counter-revolutionary. Past experience shows why demarcation lines are necessary. In 1939, the capitalist system could only recover through a full-scale worldwide war. Russia had been forced to develop capitalism after the defeat of the revolution in Europe, and was ready to ally with one side or the other according to its state interests. Germany, Italy, and Japan were fascist. In the Western democracies, socialist and communist parties managed to rally up the masses and persuaded them that unlike 1914 to 18, the New World War was to free mankind from the horrors of dictatorship. Trotskyism also supported this view, and most Trotskyists took the side of the Allied powers against Germany and Japan. Yet the triumph of democracy in 1945 has proved destructive. People no longer die in concentration camps, except where there were concentration camps, as in Russia, China, etc., but millions starve. The extreme left, Trotsky and many others, had helped capitalism rejuvenate itself. Marx had to fight against Proudhon. Lenin, Pannekoek, Bordiga had to fight against Kautsky. Pannekoek and Bordiga had to fight against Lenin, and later against Trotsky. In the 1970s, the official left consisted of social democracy and Stalinist parties. The CP... you can hear me laughing. I'm just going to say Communist Party instead of CP because it's completely destroying my flow. The Communist parties were still quite strong in France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and several Latin American countries like Argentina or Chile, and supported by a predominantly militant yet reformist working class. So these parties were able to blunt the edge of class struggle. By pseudo-revolutionary groups, we mean Maoists and Trotskyists. Now the picture has changed. Hardly any comment is needed on the decline of Western Communist parties. The Communist Party USA and the Communist Party BG have self-euthanized. There is not much left of the Italian Communist Party, and the French one only retains some power in local government, and the CGT Union Federation. The far left has been unable to fill the vacuum, in spite of its constant effort to appear less radical and more acceptable. Revolutionary pretense is over, and social ambitions have been downsized to share the riches program. Of course, with an ecological touch. This does not mean that political forces like the German Link and the French Left Front, which the much declined Communist Party is part of, and where its members meet up with the ex-Trots, or the Greek Syriza, have lost all political significance. Though front lines have shifted, the demarcations are blurred, the left and far left retain a capacity to contain and stifle an autonomous movement. The present communist movement needs to assimilate its past, to fully grasp what really happened in 1917 to 1921, and how today differs from yesterday. Communist revolution will not promote a further development of production. Capital has already accomplished this in a large number of countries. The transitional phase will consist of the immediate communization of society, which includes armed insurrections. The state's military might cannot be underestimated. Besides, the working class has become such a potential social force that it is vital for capitalism to control it. This is the job of the unions and workers' parties, so one must prepare to confront them. This is only possible through the implementation of the communist program, abolition of the market economy, creation of new social relations where labor does not rule the whole of life, but is integrated into it, destruction of economics such as politics as such, of art as such, etc. Speaking of theory, one can and must use Marx's works, which includes translating and publishing them when they are not available. Our motto is, do not read the Marxists, read Marx. It is also useful to study those who resisted counter-revolution, people like Panochet, Borga, etc., who despite misconceptions are relevant to our problems. Other groups like the Situationists International are also important, though they lack an understanding of capital. Also, it is important for revolutionaries everywhere to study the revolutionary past of their country. Such activity implies a break with politics. Revolutionaries do not only have different ideas, or even actions, from pseudo-revolutionaries. What they are is different, and the way they act is. They do not try to enroll people in order to represent them and be a power in their name. Revolutionaries are not leaders, educators, memory keepers, or information providers. We neither lead nor serve the proles. Communists are not isolated from the proletariat. Their action is never an attempt to organize others, only to express their own subversive response to the world. Ultimately, revolutionary initiatives will interconnect, but our task is not primarily one of organization. It is to convey, in a text or action, an antagonistic relation to the world, however big or small it may be. Such an act is an attack against the old world. Forward to the 1974 Black and Red edition. Author's note: small changes have been made and new notes added. In spite of its shortcomings, the Situationist International has shown, among other things, that it is important not just to understand the historical movements and act accordingly, but also to be something different from the attitudes and values of the society the revolutionary wants to destroy. The militant attitude is anti-revolutionary. It splits the individual into two, separating his needs, his real individual and social self, the reasons why he cannot stand the present world, from his action, his attempt to change the world. The militant refuses to admit that he rebels against the society because he needs to change his own life as well as society in general. He represses the impulse which made him turn against the present world. He engages in anti-capitalist activity as if it were external to him. The sacrificial character of this attitude is plain to see. The militant as an individual and political groups as organizations suffer from displaced personality. Whatever the situation may have been 50 or 100 years ago, the present revolutionary movement does not aim to bring about the conditions of communism. These have been fully created by capitalism. Our objective is no longer to further promote the development of productive forces or to maintain and support this development with coercive action by the proletariat over the petite bourgeoisie. It is the immediate communization of society. Capital has managed to invade and dominate our lives to such an extent that, at least in so-called developed countries, we are now revolutionary because we can no longer stand our relationship to our work, our friend, our environment, namely from everything to our next-door neighbor to our cat or radio program. We want to change the world because it becomes increasingly difficult to realize and assert oneself in it. Our most vital need. Others seem so close and so far at the same time. A human community is at hand. Its basis is present, a lot more so than a century ago. Passivity prevents its emergence. Mercantile ties are both fragile and strong. Capitalism reacts by diverting social impulses from revolution to politics. Revolutionary activity, which strives to realize people's needs, is divided towards a mere quest for power. For instance, people want to control their own lives, which are now regulated by the logic of commodity production and value. Political groups come and explain that the alternative is real democracy, or workers' government, or even anarchy-inspired institutions. In other words, they wish to alter the decision-making apparatus, not the social relations which determine it. They always reduce social aspirations to a problem of control or command, which ought to be given to a proletarian party or to the masses, or shared by everyone, and they express every real problem in terms of power. Yet this is only one part of the question. Communizing society is more than a sum of piecemeal actions. Though capital will be destroyed by general subversion through which people appropriate their relationship to the world, nothing decisive will be achieved so long as the state, i.e. all states, retain some of its power. The state has to be destroyed by acting on its central bodies in addition to the action which destroys its power everywhere. Both are necessary. The use of force is a relevant question. Insurrection won't be peaceful and non-violent. Capital would only be too happy to see us change our lives locally while its active process continues on a general scale. This is not a moot point. Many people are desperate to modify their personal life now, even if it boils down to a remodeled lifestyle. Capitalism can tolerate a lot: decomposition of the traditional family and hierarchy, even of mercantile relations on a limited scale, as long as these changes do not prevent it from realizing its cycle, from accumulating value. The coming revolution will paralyze it by developing direct communist relations and by systematic action against state bodies and private bourgeois militia. As for the present, what we can do is reject all forms of militantism and politics, all groups standing as mediations between the proletariat and communism, and which believe and make people believe in political solutions. Such groups are of course different from one country to another. In France and Italy, the traditional communist parties are very powerful, and the unions they control differ from North American, British, or Northern European unions. Therefore, the text on the class struggle and its most characteristic aspects might seem irrelevant to the American, German, or English contexts. But the essential process is the same. When we speak of the end of reformism, we refer to a general trend and do not mean that reformist struggles are becoming rare. On the contrary, many people inside and outside the working class are fighting for reforms, but these struggles are manifestations of something deeper. Though few strikes are similar to the one at Lordstown in the United States, 1972, such an event was symptomatic of a social tendency. The relative backwardness of France and Italy in relation to the United States or Britain has created a number of mediators which play a more open role than in other countries. In the still fairly traditional and formal French or Italian politics, the left and far left are hardened bodies which pretend to oppose the state. They still retain some ability to organize. In other countries, many extremist groups have disappeared. The American-German SDS, for example. The difficulty lies in the need to go beyond traditional Marxism while not rejecting relevant concepts. It is not enough to understand that Marcuse, Mandel, Sweezy, and Magdoff have hardly anything in common with communism. Breaking new ground means drawing a line between what to rubbish and where to begin thorough and rethink. The nub of the debate is how we envisage communism. For example, underdeveloped countries, to use a capitalist vocabulary, will not have to go through an industrialization phase similar to what advanced countries experienced in the past. In many parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, capital has not yet completely subjugated labor to its domination. Old forms of social life still exist. For how long? Communism will give them a new birth, with the help of Western technology, applied totally different from the way it was used in the West. We cannot be content with a mere demonstration of the capitalist nature of China and North Vietnam. We must also just as clearly assess the role Asia could play in a future revolution. The Ceylon Uprising of 1971 was indeed a modern movement. Utopia is back. We can already hear news from everywhere. Foreworld, Out of the Future, 1997. This was the preface to the Antagonism Press edition in London, 1997. Some changes and additions have been made to the text and notes. 1. The Untraceable. One of the best films about class conflict includes a 10-minute sharp and biting shot taken on June 10, 1968, outside the gates of the Wonder Factory, a battery maker, on the outskirts of Paris. Most of the workers were unskilled, low-paid, looked down upon women, often handling dirty chemicals. They'd been on strike since May 13th, and were just about to go back in. What concessions they snatched from the boss were a lot in terms of better work conditions, and little compared to the energy put into the struggle. In the middle of the arguing group is a woman in her 20s, half shouting, half crying, who won't be talked into returning. No, I'm not going back. I'll never set foot there again. Go see for yourself what a shithole it is, what filth we work in. In 1996, a documentary interviewed people involved in that strike, men and women workers, foremen, a Trotskyist typist, shop stewardesses, union activists, the local Communist Party leader who tried to convince the young woman to resume work. She, however, is untraceable. Few remember her well. She left the factory soon after the events, and nobody knows what became of her, or even her full name, only the first one, Jocelyn. We're left with one decisive question unanswered. The question posed by Jocelyn's reaction. In normal, peaceful life, habits and guidelines weigh upon us, and it is practically inevitable to submit. But when millions of strikers build up collective strength, render the state helpless and media words worthless, bring a whole country to the verge of overhaul change, and realize they're given pay rises which will soon be eaten up by inflation, why is it that they step back into what they know amounts to dire or soft misery for the next 20 years? Many a radical school of thought will come up with its ready-made answer and solution. Some will reply that Jocelyn and her workmates had been betrayed by the wrong sorts of leaders, or brainwashed by the media, or manipulated by the unions. Some will assert workers suffered from an absence of organization, others that they lack spontaneity and autonomy, while wise guys will explain May 68 was bound to fail because capitalist evolution had not yet created the prerequisites of the condition of the true communist revolution, which fortunately are now coming to full maturation. This is no maths exercise, we have to find the right clue. In the words of a Persian poet, this deep riddle will ne'er be solved by science and research. The following essays merely ask the first and foremost question: how does class struggle, under capitalism, history's prime mover, connect with human emancipation which goes beyond class? Class struggle concerns us insofar as it can produce its own end, communism. As we know, that struggle can also feed on itself, forcing the capital-labor relation to change, to get both softer and stronger. And this is what class struggle does most of the time. The crux of communist theory is to know if, how, and when proletarians wage a class struggle that is able to produce more than itself. Communist revolution is not just an intensified extension of the labor v capital confrontation. It intensifies this confrontation and breaks away from it. One of the texts, The Class Struggle and its Most Characteristic Aspects in Recent Years, was first conceived not long after the Wonder Plan, like many others, returned to work. Leninism and the ultra-left goes back to 1969. Capitalism and Communism came out in 1972, at the request of a number of workers who circulated the first draft at the Paris Renault plant, among others. 2. Wall Street v. Berlin Wall. These 3 essays aimed at reasserting communism against an ideology named Marxism, official leftist or academic. Why call ourselves communist? The more a lexical item means, the more likely it is to be put into hard labor by the ruling order. Like freedom, autonomy, humanity, and a host of other words, communism has been twisted, turned upside down, and is currently a synonym for life under a benevolent/dictatorial totalitarian state. Only a free, autonomous, human communist awakening will make these words meaningful again. Although common wisdom proclaims that radical thought is obsolete, the last 25 years offer ample proof of its relevance. What obsolescence? Class and class struggle? No need to read 2,000 pages by Marx to realize that those dispossessed of the means of production have fought and have so far been defeated by those who control them. In the early 19th century, a utopian socialist reformer like Saint-Simon, as well as academics, were the first to theorize class. Bourgeois historians analyzed the French Revolution as a conflict between aristocracy and bourgeoisie. 200 years later, the strength of the ruling class is to make us forget it exists. Value defined by the average social time necessary to manufacture goods. It's plain our civilization has an obsession with shortening time. Computerization, electronic highways, and cell phones on every corner street. Computerization, electronic highways, and cell phones on every street corner sped up circulation. Work, shopping, and leisure alike treat every act of life as though it has to be turned into an ever faster flow. Paul Virilio describes how economy does not produce just objects, but speed, and intended objects only as so far as they produce speed. Though his stance is completely different from Marx's, Virilio points at a world that prides itself on reducing the time needed to achieve everything, i.e., a world run by minimal time, by value. Profit-making is the driving force of this world? Anyone who has lost his job in a firm he gave 20 years of his life to can see that a company is accumulated value constantly looking for its own accretion and crushing whatever hinders it. The decreasing numbers of Western factory workers, the coming down of the Berlin Wall, and the withering away of far-left groups mean the final downfall of communism only to those who portrayed blue-collar workers as the salt of the earth, equated socialism with planned economy, and enjoyed the marching in the street under the North Vietnam flag. The collapse of so-called socialist countries proved how economy rules. East and West have both gone through accumulation crises. Trying to regain profitability required a new system of production in Cleveland, a new political regime in Moscow. State capitalism did not fail because its people got fed up with totalitarianism, but when it was no longer able to support itself and give substance to its oppression. Centralized economic planning was just about all right for developing capital goods industries, and bureaucratic power rested on a compromise with the peasants on the one hand. After the horrors of forced collectivization, the kolhoznik was left free to attend to his allotment, and the workers on the other, job for life plus minimal social security in exchange for political submission. This unspoken bargain may have been okay for Russia in 1930, but not in 1980, let alone for East Germany or Czechoslovakia in 1980. Capitalism needs some degree of competition between conflicting poles of accumulated value confronting each other, and a certain dose of political competition as well. Eventually, state-led capitalism exhausted its propulsive force, and even bureaucrats no longer believed in their own lies. The breaking up of the USSR is not the definitive refutation of Marx, but the verification of Das Kapital. The Politburo could fiddle its own internal market, but could not evade world trade pressures. The same market forces that were laying off thousands in Liverpool were busy smashing the bureaucratic dikes that blocked the streams of money and commodities in Leningrad. The spectre still haunts us. The Wall Street Journal wrote in 1991, in reference to the 1848 Manifesto, Marxist analysis can be applied to the amazing disintegration of communist regimes built on the foundations of his thought, but unfaithful to his prescriptions. 3. 1968 and all that. There had been workers' uprisings before, openly confronting both state and the industrialized labor movement, and many far more violent. After 1917, for example. But around 1970, the upheaval had something more global and deeper about it. Contrary to the 1871, 1917-21, or 1936-37, capital had penetrated the whole of life in industrialized countries, turned more and more everyday acts and relationships into commodities, a unified society under its dominion. Politics as confrontation of utterly opposed political programs was on the way out. In 68, French unions and labor parties were able to stifle a 4 or 5 million 3-week strike, but could no longer put forward a platform alternative to that of bourgeois parties. Those who had taken part in the general strike did not expect much more from a possible left government than a more generous welfare. Mixed economy was the order of the day, with an emphasis on state intervention when the left was in power, on market forces when the votes swung to the right. In the 1960s, less than now, but a lot more than before 1939-45, but a lot more before the 1939-45 war, commodity relationships mediated the simplest human needs. The American dream is yours if you're rich enough to buy it. Even so, the most desirable car is never the one you've just bought, rather the next one on the TV commercial. Goods are always, at best, on posters. Just when a Russian-style workers' paradise was no longer valid, the consumer heaven appeared just out of reach. So no future could be found through the factory, neither the nightmare on the other side of the Iron Curtain, nor the dreamland this side of the screen. As a result, the workplace declined as a place where to start building a better world. Although the situationist Society of the Spectacle had a few readers at its time, its publication in 1967 was a forerunner of critiques to come. True, that period also meant unionization for many downtrodden, poorly paid workers who finally got into the 20th century and only a minority of the working class voiced a refusal of society. Rebels were the cause on the fringe of the labor force, the young especially. But the worldwide strike and riot wave remain incomprehensible without its underlying characteristic, mass disaffection for factory and office life. Who wants to work? Newsweek asked in the mid-1970s. Still, nearly all sit-downs occupied the workplace and went no further. There were many transgressing gestures, takeover of gas and transport service by Polish strikers in 1971, Italian reduction, squatting, giveaway social strikes by bus drivers, hospital staff and supermarket cashiers, providing transport, healthcare and food free of charge, electricity workers cutting off supplies to bureaucrats or firms, and 1,000 other instances, yet hardly any turned into a beginning of communization. The disruption of work and the trespassing of a commodity did not merge into an attack on work as commodity, i.e. wage labor as such. From prison to child education, everything came under fire, yet the assault remained mainly negative. The lack of creative attempts to transform society gave the impetus back to capitalism. Historical upheavals have no date of birth or death, but surely fiat was more than a symbol, a landmark. For years the Turin firm had been plagued by permanent stoppages of assembly lines, mass abstentionism, and meetings on the premises. However, organized disorder did not transcend negation into something positive. Thus, the management was able to break up a fairly large minority with the passive help of a weary majority, fearing for their jobs. Radicals had disrupted a social logic, not shifted into a new one. Violent, even armed actions gradually disconnected from the shop floor. In 1980, the company laid off 23,000 out of 140,000. The factory went on strike for 35 days, until a mix of 40,000 Fiat workers, clerks, and middle managers took to the streets against the strike. The union signed a compromise where 23,000 got state compensation money, and later many more thousands were sacked through rationalization. On such turning points was the social surge of the 1960s to 70s reversed. Logically, worker class defeat was translated into political terms, on all sides of the political spectrum. On the right, Thatcher and Reagan epitomized the liberal swing. On the left, the French Socialist Party came into power in 1981, only to turn to austerity after 2 years. British Labour embraced market economics. The Italian Communist Party used to get as much as 30% of the overall vote in the 1970s. It gradually gave up any extremist appearances, became the party of the democratic left, dropped the hammer and sickle, evolved into the Democrats of the left, and later a mere democratic party. 4. Working man's blues. Since the defeats of the European, North American, and Japanese working class have been due to its defensive position against a constantly mobile opponent. However, deeply entrenched in the mines or workshops, workers' militancy could not resist restructuring. Labour is strong as long as it is necessary to capital. Otherwise, it can delay redundancy, sometimes for years with support from the rest of the working community, but it can't stay on forever as an unprofitable labour force. In the 1970s and 80s, workers had number and organisation. Latter they lost because the economy deprived them of their function, which is their social weapon. As proved by the English miners' strike in 1984 to 85, nothing will force capital to hire labour that is not useful to it, and 10 years later there were more university lecturers than miners in England. For years, assembly line workers had rejected being treated like human robots, while a minority turned away from work and the consumer society. Capital replied by installing mechanical robots, suppressing millions of jobs and revamping, intensifying, decifying what was left of unskilled labour. At the same time, a widespread desire for freedom was converted into freedom to buy. In 1960, who imagined that one day a 12-year-old could cash out of a dispenser with her own plastic card? Her money, her freedom. The famous slogans of '68, never work and ask for the impossible, were mocked when people were forced out of secure jobs and offered even more plentiful and frustrating goods to buy, often on credit. Many compare today's situation to the 1920s and 30s, fascist threat included. However, unlike the insurrections and armed counter-revolutions that took place between 1917 and 1937, the present proletarian setback has been protracted and gradual absorption of the vast sections of the working class into joblessness and casualization. If there were a hope, it must lie in the proles, Winston said in 1984. It's as though a lot of these proles of the real 1984 year had been fighting for 2 weeks, nearly taken the world into their hands, but refused to accept or change until the impetus ran out of steam. In the 1920s, their grandfathers had locked themselves behind factory gates, sometimes with guns, Italy 1920, fought and died, and class conflict ended up with bosses' victory. This time, a handful got their guns, and even less with mass unemployment, one does not shoot at a closing plant. So, more a failure than defeat. Like a player stepping aside from a fixed game, he can't or won't smash the place, and lets the fixers win. That game was lost, there's no use denying it. Capitalism triumphs more fluid and immaterial than 25 years ago, universaling everything into abstract, passive, screen-wise negative way. A 60s commercial reproduced in Situationist International No. 7 pictured factory workers commenting on a newspaper page with an advertisement for washing machine and wondering who makes this model, forcibly part-time or flexible. The year 2000 car worker will watch Crash on TV while his kid plays a video game that uses chips that could one day downsize his father or himself. Never before has humankind been so unified and divided. Billions watch the same pictures and live even more separate lives. Goods are at the same time mass-produced and unavailable. In 1930, millions were out of work because of a huge economic breakdown. Now, millions are on the dole. The economy cannot make profits out of them as it did in the post-1945 recovery. The profitability crisis of the 1970s is not over, and labour productivity has risen so much that capital needs less labour to valorize itself. 5. High hopes. The workers' movement that existed in 1900, or still in 1936, was neither crushed by fascist repression nor brought off by transistors or fridges. It destroyed itself as a force of change because it aimed at preserving the proletarian condition, not superseding it. At best, it got a better life for the toiling masses. That seemed to tame the system, before the system produced its worst in the form of 2 world wars. The workers' movement as we knew it is dead as now as British old labour, and the popularity of films about workers' culture is a sure sign of its passing from reality into memories and museums. Stalinists turn social democrat and social democracy goes centre-left. Everybody shifts to the right, and soon Trotskyists will name themselves radical Democrats. As for us, we won't feel nostalgic about a time when crowds paraded the streets singing the International, when they were in fact supporting groups trying to be the extreme left of the left. The purpose of the old labour movement was to take over the same world and manage it in a new way, forcing the leisure class to work, turning unproductive into productive work, developing industry, introducing workers' democracy, in theory of course. Only a tiny minority, anarchist as well as Marxist, held that a different society meant the destruction of state, commodity, and wage labour, although it rarely defined this as a process, rather as a program put into practice after the seizure of power, often after a fairly long transition period. These revolutionaries failed to grasp communism as a social movement whose action would undermine the foundations of class and state power, and misunderstood the subversive potential of fraternal, open, communistic relationships that kept re-emerging in every deep insurrection. Russia 1917-19, Catalonia 1936-37. There is no need to create the capitalist preconditions of communism anymore. Capitalism is everywhere, yet much less viable than 100 or 50 years ago when class distinctions ostensibly showed up. The manual worker identified the factory owner at one glance, knew or thought he knew his enemy, and felt he'd be better off the day he and his mates got rid of the boss. Today, classes still exist, but manifested through infinite degrees in consumption, and no one expects a better world from public ownership of industry. The enemy is an impalpable social relationship, abstract yet real, all-pervading yet no monster beyond our reach. Because the proletarians are the ones that produce and reproduce the world, they can disrupt and revolutionize it. The aim of a future revolution will be immediate communization, not fully completed before a generation or more, but to be started from the beginning. Capital has invaded life. It determines how we eat, sleep, love, visit, or bury friends, to such an extent that our objective can be only the social fabric, invisible, all-encompassing. Although capital is quite good at hiring personnel to defend it, social inertia is a greater conservative force than media or police. The 1991 Los Angeles riots went further than those of the Watts in 1965. The succession of estate riots shows a significant fraction of youth cannot be integrated. Here and there, in spite of mass unemployment, workers won't be blackmailed into accepting lower wages as a barter against job creation. South Korean factory workers have proved the world company spreads shop floor restlessness at the same time it accumulates windfall profits. And backward Albania gave birth to a modern rising in 1997. In the early 1980s, supposedly docile South Korean labor grew into an insubordinate social force. A few landmarks: the 1980 Gwangju Popular Rising, crushed by the army, the 1987 Great Labor Struggle, the 1996-97 Great General Strike. On Albania in 1997, see Upheaval in the Land of Eagles. When a sizable majority fed up with virtual reality starts making possibilities real, revolution will rise again, terrible and anonymous. This is dedicated to Jocelyn, the unknown worker.